Hello, thanks to everyone who is here in person and watching online. I'd like to start by saying that we are honored to gather on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, who have stewarded these lands for generations. It is our duty to recognize, respect, and honor the treaties that have shaped our shared history and continue to guide our path towards reconciliation, a commitment that is central to the Office of the Ombudsman. Thank you. I'm here today to present the report of the investigation we conducted into the Ontario government's out-of-home advertising. Thank you for being here to listen to the observations, conclusions, and recommendations contained in the report, which can also be found on our website, www.ombudsman.on.ca. In July last year, I notified Cabinet Office, the Ministry of Health, and the Ministry of Francophone Affairs of my intention to launch an investigation on my own initiative into the application of the French Language Services Act to the Ontario government's out-of-home advertising. Out-of-home advertising includes, for example, billboards in public places, on the side of the road, and on public transit, and so forth. Why did I decide to investigate this on my own initiative? Over the years, we have received several cases where Francophones told us they saw English-only government advertisements in public places. We intervened in individual cases and resolved them. During the pandemic, my team and I noticed more and more English Ontario government advertising in public places. The ads in question provided essential public health information about COVID-19, social distancing, and vaccination, for example. This was not surprising. The government is increasingly using outdoor advertising to communicate with Ontarians. According to the Office of the Auditor General of Ontario, the government spent more than $58 million on advertising for the 2021-2022 fiscal year. 15% of this amount was allocated to outdoor advertising. At the time the investigation was launched, the amounts allocated to outdoor advertising had more than tripled since 2017. Expenditures increased from nearly $3 million to nearly $9 million for 2021-2022. During the pandemic, information that was communicated by the Ontario government on behalf of the Ministry of Health in public places was essential public health information. This information was available almost exclusively in English. The French Language Services Act gives Francophones the right to expect communication in French from provincial government agencies. This contradiction between what the Act says and the government's practice led me to launch, on my own initiative, an investigation to assess how the government takes the French Language Services Act into account when it communicates with Ontarians in public places. The investigation focused on essential public information communicated by the government at the height of the pandemic between April 1st, 2020 and March 31st, 2023, and the role played by Cabinet Office and the Ministry of Health, as well as, of course, the Ministry of Francophones, which is responsible for the application of the French Language Services Act by the public service. That said, the observations contained in the report broadly apply to practices established by the public service whenever out-of-home advertising is developed. As part of the investigation, the team from the Office of the Ontario Ombudsman, which includes the French Language Services Unit, looked into 17 campaigns developed by or on behalf of the Ministry of Health, which included out-of-home advertising. Only 3 of these campaigns included any outdoor advertising in French. Our investigation revealed that the Cabinet Office centralized process for developing advertising campaigns does not contain any direct reference to the French Language Services Act, the obligations it contains, or how to meet them. Instead, Cabinet Office has an unwritten rule according to which 5% of the overall budget of each campaign must be used to reach Francophones. As a result, the distribution of advertisements in French, is guided by a budgetary rule. However, the application of the French Language Services Act is not dependent on administrative convenience and vague funding concerns, as indicated by the Court of Appeal in the context of the Montfort decision, and is not limited to 5% of the population of Ontario, nor 5% of its territory. We noticed that most of the officials involved in developing the government's out-of-home advertising were not aware of the French Language Services Act or the tools developed by the Ministry of Francophones and Cabinet Office to supervise communications in French, namely the Directive on Communications in French and its guidelines. Those who were familiar with these tools told us that they provided neither clarity nor precision on how they apply to the use of French in out-of-home advertising. These practices and this lack of knowledge have major consequences for services in French in Ontario. Cabinet Office and the other two ministries are systematically failing to fulfill their obligations under the French Language Services Act when they communicate only in English in public places through out-of-home advertising. And ultimately, it is all those who speak French who miss out on this information from the Ontario government. And during the time period we looked at, this was information about how to stay safe and healthy during a health crisis. In light of these findings, 7 recommendations are therefore necessary to improve the way in which out-of-home advertising is developed. These recommendations will help improve the way in which Cabinet Office, the Ministry of Francophone Affairs, and other involved ministries communicate their information in French and promote compliance with the French Language Services Act. We recommend in particular that Cabinet Office should develop all advertisements that will be displayed in public places in a bilingual format, and that the public service tools that govern communications, such as the Directive on Communications in French and its guidelines, be updated by the ministries to reflect this practice, and that staff involved in developing out-of-home advertising be trained to use these tools. The 3 ministries mentioned in this investigation will have to report to us every 6 months in individual reports on their progress in implementing my recommendations. Although the investigation covered a specific period, that of the pandemic, the observations contained in the report affect the public service's standard approach to developing out-of-home advertising. The recommendations therefore apply to all out-of-home advertising developed by Cabinet Office for the Ontario Government going forward. This report was shared in advance with the 3 ministries. According to their response, 5 of the 7 recommendations were accepted. However, Cabinet Office has not committed to systematically developing bilingual out-of-home advertising as stated in Recommendation 1. According to the response submitted to us, Cabinet Office commits to evaluating how it can continue to increase the visibility of French language messages and media, while maintaining best practices in advertising in order to ensure value for money. The Ministry of Francophone Affairs also indicated that Recommendation 2, which aims to integrate specific standards for out-of-home advertising into the Directive on Communications in French, is under review. As we established in our investigation, the French Language Services Act requires government out-of-home advertising to be available in French as well as in English. As I mentioned earlier, the judgment of the Ontario Court of Appeal in the context of the Montfort case tells us that language rights are not dependent on administrative convenience and vague funding concerns. Without accepting all of the recommendations, the government will not be able to adequately implement the recommendations and meet its obligations under the French Languages Services Act. We will therefore continue our proactive work with the government to ensure that all of the recommendations are accepted and implemented correctly. We will assess the progress made by the 3 ministries in progress reports every 6 months, and we will report publicly when it is appropriate to do so. Thank you for your attention, and I can take your questions now. You were talking about the famous unwritten rule, 5%. Do you know where that comes from? Has it been long that the government follows this unwritten rule? No. What I do know is that the French Language Services Act, as applied to outdoor advertising, to any kind of outdoor billboard or advertising, requires of the government that communication should be carried out both in French and in English. And the French language communication can be simpler in bilingual format when the message is targeting the entire population. One theory about where that might come from is that, well, we'll just apply the rule. It's an easy way to handle this. I don't want to speculate on something I haven't studied in depth. What we did in this investigation was to look at public places where Francophones are often highways and public transit, gathering places where this kind of advertising is very much in view. And what worries me is that there's a supplementary obstacle for Francophones to receive these important communications from the government. And when you're in a public place, it should be simple for Francophones to access this information at the same time as others in a format that they understand. That means bilingual information that is offered in these public places that were part of the investigation. You're talking about outdoor advertising, but are you aware if other types of advertising also raise some alarms? For example, online advertising. In my annual report last December, I made a very specific recommendation about government communication on social networks. I asked the government to standardize through the Ministry of Francophones all communication that is carried out on social media, government social media, because we saw that their social media, government social media, was not communicating as much in French as it was in English. So as far as communications go, when you use public platforms, public format, social media, for example, or outdoor advertising, which we looked at in this investigation, of course, we have to keep in mind that these are communications, these are messages that Francophones can easily access, and so the appropriate tools should be provided for Francophones to understand these messages. That means the messages should be in French also. Question. So this is a proactive investigation that you take on your own initiative. Are there any types of initiatives you'd like to take on your own initiative? Well, we're always looking at trends and also what people are drawing to attention. So yes, most definitely there will be investigations carried out, but it's a bit premature now to say where the next investigation will be taking place. But we just want to make sure that the French Language Services, with respect to the French Language Services Act, we make recommendations regarding the application of the law, the improvement of French language services in Ontario, and that takes place in our annual reports, but also in our special investigations. We will indeed be carrying out other investigations. When the government responds by talking about value for money, is it not just admission? For example, are they aware that they're actually in violation of the French language service? Do you feel that they've understood this? I hope that the report will send out a very clear message about the French Language Services Act and what's expected when it comes to outdoor communications, outdoor advertising, and why these messages should be also available in French. The material should be developed in both languages, and that this is the way to ensure that the information is accessible, that there should be no additional obstacles for Francophones wanting to access the information. And so this is how to be in compliance with the French Language Services Act. There are indeed advantages when it comes to complying to the French Language Services Act. For example, tourism, tourists from around the world. There are many French language speakers who come to Ontario. When we're trying to attract different skilled professionals to occupy vacant posts, and when we're trying to bring in French language immigrants into Ontario, we actually have a strong interest in ensuring that the French Language Services Act is complied with. French has its place in Ontario. People should know that they have rights flowing from the French Language Service Act, and people do generally know this. And this is very much in the spirit of the French Language Service Act. Last year, the government put forth regulation on the active offer of French language services, and this actually encourages French language communication with the French-speaking population in Ontario. The Ombudsman here recently for his annual report, and he was saying that for the French language service, you received a record number of complaints, a 66% increase, 500 more complaints. I know you'll be releasing your annual report later this year, but you have some words on this now. I've spent a lot of time of talking with Francophones, of going to the different regions of the country to meet different groups, to meet French language speakers where they live, to talk about the French language service, to talk about the French Language Services Act, and I hope that this type of promotional work is what has given rise to the difference people can make when they see shortcomings, and that we can, in our office, indeed obtain results for French language speakers. And it also shows the efforts that we have made to ensure that the law is complied with. This can make a difference in the daily lives of French language speakers when the rights they can and should expect are upheld. We can do work for French language speakers in this province, and I think that might be what's behind the increased number of complaints, greater awareness. Someone on the line? The next question is from Liv Dugal from Oscillium.
Hi, good morning. Hi, good morning. Thanks for taking our questions. I guess I was just wondering, you had mentioned that you launched this investigation on your own accord and also based on some observations. Since last March, the period in which you did this investigation, I'm just wondering if you've noticed any change when it comes to the out-of-home advertising.
So we're very specifically interested in the period of time during the pandemic, and that was critical information and public health information that was made available to the public in general, and that should have been made available for Francophones. So we've looked at those specifically, and we gather all the facts and the data with regards to those issues during that specific period of time. But the recommendations that we are presenting today are recommendations that touch generally how out-of-home advertising is developed. And moving forward, the material should be presented in a bilingual format where Francophones and Anglophone alike can understand the information that's being presented in very public areas. So I'm very focused on a specific period of time, but looking into the future to see improvement, and we'll monitor that through progress report that will be provided to us by the three ministries every 6 months.
Okay. Okay, thanks. And just regarding the recommendation to make all out-of-home government ads bilingual, I'm wondering, why do you think the government hasn't been as willing to kind of readily accept that recommendation?
So the response we got was that the recommendation itself was under review. So we are looking forward to continuing to work proactively with the government to hopefully get the government to accept fully the recommendation that the information be made available in French simultaneously. From my perspective, this flows from bilingual ads and designs. So we'll continue our proactive work with government to that regards, and emphasizing the added value to having a broader public that's being reached by communicating in two languages in very public places.
Okay, thanks. That's all for me.
Merci.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? No further questions. Thank you very much. Thank to one and all, and enjoy the weekend. Thank you.